concert tonight.
Are they playing tonight?
Yeah.
See how that goes. Who's your son?
I just don't be now.
Well, I hope they don't call me up. Don't need me playing. My kid's got some Jody Shelley's daughter. So he's out there. He's on the coaching list. Yeah, he's particularly large.
So,
I know. He's got clear instructions though. He's good.
seems like a nice guy.
Yeah, he is pretty nice. He's pretty good with kids. You're signed out. You got signed out. Okay. Okay, so since we're just chatting, let's see, on the midterm, so the grade's pretty good. So the average grade was 78. I know it looks terrible. Don't worry, do not despair. So I'm not gonna curve any particular grade. At the end of the year, the whole course will be curved in a sense. I'll tell you exactly where we are with that by tomorrow morning. You can't look at the midterm without looking at everything else. The midterm is just simply not worth as much as everything else, right? So the average for everything else is much higher. So the average right now is, I'm guessing, I looked at it preliminarily this morning, the average for all the stuff right now is around 85, 86. So that's what you have to be thinking about. And so what I will do is I will provide you at this point what the sort of AEDE scale is, given the current set of grades that we have. I'll provide that in the email tomorrow. But even that is preliminary because it depends on the year. What matters is the end of the year. Not so much right now, but it is useful to have that information. So I'll provide that information by tomorrow. If anyone has any questions on the exam, you should get very well on. Some of those questions are extremely hard. I get that, especially dispatch questions. And a few of the other questions are complicated. It's intended to be hard because it's it's an open book test. We want to challenge people. Of course, we want people to do well in the class, so everybody is doing really well in class. So you shouldn't get too worried. But it is a hard return. Okay. Anyone has any questions on the midterm? Feel free to send me an email or come see me or have a chat with you about your particular grade or just a general question.
The grades are muted right now. So
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can unmute those.
that's fine.
I didn't realize I did that. I didn't even know that I pushed that button to do that in the first place. I don't know why I had it pushed last year.
It's great to know that we did well.
Yeah, sorry about that. I had no idea. I don't know why I would push differently this year than last year. So have a look at that tonight. You don't have to look at it right now. I'm going to look it up right now. Anyone goes and looks it up right now, I'm just going to tell them what they go. Okay, something like that. All right. But do go and look at that. And then anyone has any questions about it, let me know. You got it open up. Okay. How about the answers? Are the answers available? Can you make the answers available as well? I know that wasn't, it was set so there wasn't supposed to be immediately available the answers and the answer. So the answer should be there so you can see those. Yeah, so ask me a question. So maybe Thursday. Okay, so Thursday is really important. Everybody shows up on Thursday. Okay, so I'll send an email about that as well. So Thursday, we're going to do the assignments for the group project. So the group project course. And so we'll do the assignments for that and have some time to for the groups to form and talk with each other in class. So it's really important. So tell your friends who aren't here today to be here on Thursday. It's really critical. Although I will say that people last year did an awesome job, even though they never had a chance to be in the same room, at least initially. So, you know, let's take advantage of that on Thursday. At least one chance to get together. There should be at least one other time, maybe 2 times during the term, or rest of the term, we'll have opportunities during class for groups just to get together. Take some time for that. I'll have the prompts available for you all to see that. Okay. Group project, what it involves is going to be a 1-page written thing and then a presentation, PowerPoint, that you're going to make for everybody here for the last 2 classes doing presentations. So basically, as we'll talk about on Thursday, the presentation is essentially going to be a debate. So there are, I think we're going to have 6 questions, and there'll be roughly 4 to 5 people in each group. And you're going to be on one side of the question, and another 4 to 5 people on the other side of the question. So you'll each get a chance to do your presentation and have a chance to debate with each other, as well as take questions from the crowd. So in the past, it's worked great. Last year, we didn't do it that way. We did still sort of plus of people arguing for and against. We didn't have actual debates. But in any event, it's contemporary questions related to the energy sector and the environment. So I'll have a handout on that. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Comments? Anything? Yeah.
I can't find this on here.
It should be there now.
I found it under your files, it's under the 2020.
I didn't change the slides from last year, so it's 2020.
I just don't think that Bible was supposed to really take over on that.
You know, I'm an idiot, I'm sorry. I didn't intend to not do that. It just didn't happen. So, I don't know why the 2021 ones aren't on there, but it doesn't really matter. It's probably because I didn't change them. David, I apologize. I'm not trying to be glib about that. I just, sometimes my brain says it did something. As you get older, you figure that out. Your brain will tell you you did that. My kids are doing that all the time. Okay. Anything else? You guys want to make me feel smaller than what I am? It's all right. It's good. They always say humility is a good thing, right? You gotta be humble. Yeah, I'm not humble, but it's always good to be humiliated. Okay, I'm trying to think what the most biggest humiliation was for me ever in class. I'm not sure. I'm sure there's a lot of. Maybe it'll happen this year. Okay, whatever. You ready to go? Yay, monopolies, cartels, isn't that great? You guys love to be there right now. I'd love to be there right now. Probably actually snowing right there right now. Place, go there. Okay, go there. Whatever you do, go there.
Where is that?
All right. So I want to tell you, I don't want anyone else to be in that spot. Right? It's a great spot. I don't want anyone else there. Okay, so what are we? So I got to start out with this. This is not great. But it's good. Okay, so anyways, if you're into economics, you'll recognize the assumptions of a competitive market. I'm going to put this up there because, you know, what's really important about the energy sector is that there are places in which the competitive market works great. So the oil sector, helps us explain. So we've sort of basically been using that to explain all these sort of dirty energy sectors, right? Oil, natural gas, coal. We've really just been talking about them as sort of these competitive little markets. What we really want to move to for the rest of the class is that, these assumptions are not great, right? In fact, actually, we just want to move away from those because they really don't fit what's really happening in the sectors. Yes, it's great that we have a competitive oil market, but what's ignored by that is the externality of the oil consumption, right? So while, it's kind of a quote unquote competitive market, it's only a competitive market because we're ignoring some of the externalities associated with the use of that stuff, right? So we're going to talk about externalities. What we want to talk about first is what affects these sectors is importantly sort of the many buyers and sellers, right? Which is that there's a different failure that's really important, particularly in the oil sector, which is that we do have the potential for monopolies, cartels at least to evolve in the oil sector. And we have the observation of that with OPEC, which we're going to talk about, which is really important to understand. We talk about climate change, we talk about externalities and public goods, right? And now we'll talk about some of this monopoly, which actually is not just important for the oil sector, but also turns out to be important for the electricity sector. Bruce made reference to it before. There's this thing called a natural monopoly, which is how the electric sector is actually set up, and how in fact most of our publicly provided goods like telephone, natural gas, electricity, how it's provided to us individually is through what we call a natural monopoly. So we have to talk about this market failure. So I just put this up there just so you realize that there are market failures that are really important in the sector. And we're going to talk a lot about these ones down here, public good, externality part. But let's just talk for a day about the monopoly part. All right. Yes. Woo! Okay, great. Whatever. Definition of monopoly: a single company produces sufficiently large amounts of goods or services that they change output prices change. That is a mouthful. A single company that produces a sufficiently large amount of goods or service such that if they change output prices change. So there's lots of examples of that. Standard Oil in the early 1800s. Talked about that one. AT&T was a government-sanctioned natural monopoly for many, many years. So the government decided they didn't want it. Maybe Google and Facebook are monopolies on information in some way, shape, or form. Certainly Google probably is with respect to searches online, right? Facebook maybe is with respect to communications and social networking, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so monopoly is where you have a single company that produces enough that they can actually, by changing the output, they can change the price. So they get to be a price setter, right? Okay. Monopsony is a different kind of monopoly. It's a monopoly of an input market. So it's kind of the typical way of thinking about it is that you get a company count, right? So it's where a great example of coal companies like Southeastern Ohio or West Virginia or something like that. The coal company is the only employer in town. And basically because they're such a big employer, they not only own the coal mine, they also own the grocery store. So they also own all the places where people buy pretty much anything, right? So they sort of control everything. So then they control basically the labor price, right? So they can set the wage. So this has been true historically. There's lots of places where companies got control over a particular input market, and they're able to control prices that way. So monopsony is exactly like a monopoly, but it's where they have control of the input market rather than the output market. Okay. So even though a big coal company in West Virginia may control labor rates, and therefore can get really favorable labor rates, that is, they can drive wages down, they don't control the price of coal, right? Because they still are in a competitive market for the coal that they produce and sell, right? So they're not a monopolist, but they're a monopsonist. So So they still gain a lot of power and a lot of benefit out of that. Right? It's a small distinction, but it's important. A cartel is just a group of firms who try to coordinate their production. So they try to act like a monopolist. Right? So the individual ones, the individual companies don't have enough control over, if they change their output, they won't change prices necessarily. But if they get 3 or 4 of their neighbors together, then they can work together and they can't change prices. And that's what we actually experience, at least in the oil sector, right? So we have a cartel at play, OPEC, oil producing exporting countries is kind of the big example there, right? Okay, so cartel is a form of monopoly, where it's kind of a group gets together and tries to create a monopoly. Okay, so in economic terms, what happens? So rather than demand and supply being equated, what happens is the producer who has monopoly power restricts output, the prices end up higher. Right? So take advantage of the fact that they might be the big or the only supplier, and they're able to restrict output. And by restricting output, that allows prices to be higher. And they basically steal profit. Right? The whole point of that, if you're, I'm not going to ask you all to remember this or regurgitate this, but if you're in economics, you'll recognize that's consumer surplus, right? So what does a monopolist do? It steals some of it away and creates profit out of it, right? So they're stealing away benefits from consumers who would otherwise get low prices, and they charge them higher prices, and then they convert that into profits for themselves and steal that away from consumers. Okay, so continuing, right? Continuing to do it. So oil is a globally traded commodity. Prices fluctuate based on world trends. New technologies have increased production. So it's become harder and harder actually to do this. And what we're going to find in the oil sector is that this OPEC cartel has at various times, and right now is interesting, one of those times that they're able to actually exert some control. Actually, whenever they can do that, they actually take advantage of that, exert some control by restricting output and raising prices and reaping some profits out of that. But it never lasts forever. So it's one interesting thing about oil. So oil is a market where we have evidence that a cartel, namely OPEC, has operated pretty successfully, but not continuously successfully historically. Okay, they're successful from time to time, and they take advantage of it, cause all this mayhem by raising energy prices. And they're able to do that, but then ultimately new technologies come around. We talked about fracking as being the new technology that came around and essentially broke the cartel for about a decade. Now it seems like maybe we're going back into a period where the cartel has a little more power than they had. Right? Natural gas does not look like it's susceptible to the same sort of cartel-like problems. Which is kind of surprising because natural gas is, it's fairly widely traded, but not as widely traded as oil. So it's interesting in oil, where it's a globally traded commodity, shipped on boats pretty easily, right? It's not like natural gas where it has to be frozen to minus 400 degrees or something like that before it's put on a ship, right? It's not a complex technological thing to get it shipped from one place to another. But yet oil is the one that has a bigger cartel problem. Natural gas has less of a cartel problem. So it just, it's interesting that these two commodities, surprisingly in some ways, that one is more susceptible to it than another. And that's really particularly because of the low cost nature of, we saw that, that large sort of supply function for oil, right? But we also saw there was a big chunk of that oil was really low cost and it was produced in the Middle East. Right? That's a big reason why. Because such low-cost oil is available to a particular set of countries, 2 or 3 of them, they're able to exert that kind of control. So, significant proportion of the output at a low price. Okay, so OPEC, these are the countries that are in OPEC. So the blue ones are the countries that are in OPEC. So the big ones, They have a big production capability here in the Middle East, obviously, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, also Libya, Tunisia, et cetera, et cetera. Kenya, yes. Lower Nigeria, just say just because it's south there.
That is so.
What did you say it was?
Niger.
This one?
Oh, no, no.
Yeah, what's this one?
Maybe Cameroon.
It's got long.
Who said that?
I'm not sure. I think it's.
I have no idea. Oh, I know what that is. That's Panama. Just kidding. You're supposed to correct me. Come on. That's Venezuela, right? What's this one? Okay. That's it. You get the picture, right? Okay, so why is this a cartel? They have 72% food reserve, so, you know, it turns out that Venezuela has a huge amount of food reserve, right? And 43% of food production. And what's really important about that 43% is the lowest cost stuff, in particular in the Middle East, right? Okay. Fascinating in this is the big chunk that Russia's not part of that, or any of this sort of former Russian, I should say, Soviet Union countries here that have a large amount of oil reserves as well, right? So they're not part of OPEC, which oftentimes these days here people talk about OPEC plus, and Russia does in many times go to OPEC meetings annually and sets some of their production outputs in line with OPEC from time to time, as a do right now. Yeah.
Can you re-explain why the low cost oil is important for the cartel?
Well, a big chunk of this because they're able to actually increase production and reduce production quickly, right? And when you have that low cost source of oil, it makes it, you can increase it and reduce it pretty quickly from time to time. It turns out your profit margins are really good. Because you end up getting this price change here. You've got this, you know, your oil price, your cost is here. If you can get the price to go from here to here, right, by reducing your output, that has a massive effect. So you can actually get big profits out of it. Right? Probably the bigger issue as to why it's important to them, but why they the bigger issue is that not only is it low cost, but it's a large amount. Which produces a large amount. So, I don't know what the actual amount that Saudi Arabia produces. They have the lowest cost oil in the world, and they produce a large amount. So they're probably half of that production, yes. Yeah. Yeah, so there is a lot of conflict. They don't all actually get together, right? So you know from history of the Middle East, as we've learned in the last 20 years, that there's a huge conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Both trying to be sort of a player in the Middle East, right? They are dominated by two components of, as I understand it, of the Islamic faith, which are different from each other, different sort of viewpoints of the world, and even the history of that faith. So those two countries don't agree on a lot of stuff outside of oil production. So that creates issues in terms of how you would actually get cohesion amongst the group, right? And then you have other countries in other parts of the world that have completely different conflicts, essentially, right? This is so Venezuela is basically become a socialist country, more like a dictatorship makes sense, which is very good. I mean, Saudi Arabia is kind of a dictatorship on the one hand, but also is a pretty free market economy in many other regards, right? So there's lots of differences in the countries that we yeah.
I was gonna say I was wrong, it's Nigeria. If he's right, that was that one.
That's Nigeria.
Yeah.
Well, Kenya's over here. Yeah, Nigeria. Good one. Good. What's that one? Here. Angola? Who said that? Me?
Yep.
What's that one? You see it? Just kidding. Just kidding. Okay. All right. So what makes a good cartel worker? So there's basically 5 things that are really important: price elasticity, compatibility, the compatibility issues one, income elasticity, new discoveries, and the demand side. So we'll go through each of these. So price elasticity is really important. So it turns out that why is it that oil is susceptible to being a monopoly / cartel? It's because it's so inelastically demanding. What is it about inelastic demand?
This is like big spikes in price.
Okay.
There's like less in quantity.
That's absolutely 100% true. So when you shift, so an outcome of that, right? So an outcome is, so if you're a cartel, that's really, let's go back to that. So what you said, what's your name again? Lauren. Lauren? You know, what Lauren said was that, you know, when you shift quantities, prices change a lot. So yes, absolutely, right? Go back to that picture. I mean, you want to restrict quantity a little bit, have a huge price change, right? That's the way you're going to get the biggest profit you can, right? Okay, so when you have a really inelastic demand function, if you're a company and you're looking to become a monopolist, you would want to go out and look for those markets that have really inelastic demand functions, right? Because those are the markets that will give you the biggest potential, right? Okay, so there's one other aspect of that really steeply sloped demand function. Not just that, yeah, it creates a huge price change with a small shift in the quantity. There's another aspect of this, which is what? So go back to why is it that that demand function is so steeply sloped in the first place? Yeah.
People are still going to be oil regardless of the price.
There are no substitutes. Exactly. People are going to use the oil no matter what the price is. They're screwed, right? They have to. They have no choice, right? There are very few substitutes for it. So if there are a few substitutes, right, then of course you'll have this really steeply sloped demand function. It will be really inelastic, and therefore prices will change a lot. And even when prices change a lot, people have to still use it, right? So it kind of all fits together. And that, you know, so price elasticity is a big reason why we've seen monopolies emerge in certain sectors. And it turns out that the price elasticity, the demand function, is more steeply sloped for oil than it is for natural gas and for coal. It just turns out that because it's so critically important for transportation, like the internal combustion engine, which we use for moving stuff everywhere, right, is such a critically important part of our economy, not just our economy here, but economies around the world. It makes this, you know, this good oil really susceptible to monopolization / cartelization. Kind of sounds like a food production.
You see monopolies in any industry where there's elastic demand, or is it?
No, it can't exist in an industry where it's elastic. If there were substitutes for oil, then OPEC would have no power, right? So this is what OPEC is most worried about. What are they most worried about? What are substitutes for oil? Electric cars, right? So yeah, they're worried to death about that, right? And this is something you fight over if you're a cartel, right? So if you could pick one set of countries out there that are really specifically working to make sure that there aren't new rules and regulations in place that would encourage more electric cars, what countries would you pick? Gabon. Who said Gabon? No? I mean, they probably don't want that much. But they're probably against it, right? In a sense, because they gain a lot from, you know, access to the cartel and prices, right? So substitutes have a huge effect, right? So substitutes for oil are expensive. transition times are long, solar energy does settle longer. So we do have this sort of backstop, but ultimately the cartel's gonna dissipate. It's gonna be irrelevant, right? Ultimately, there are substitutes, but not right now. Maybe eventually there will be. It's just for now, organization like OPEC has opportunity, right? That's exactly what's happening right now. We've been reading news reports on in the energy sector. This is exactly where we find ourselves today. We've got this recovery from the pandemic. We had this massive supply of oil from the fracking industry in the US. We had a big increase in oil production that happened, right? So there's something like 400 oil rigs in the US that are sitting on the sidelines that aren't doing anything. Okay. So these are oil rigs that could be used either in Ohio, could be used natural gas, or could be used in Bakken or Texas or something like that to produce oil. And they're not being used right now. Why are they not being used right now? They're not being used as far as I can tell because not because prices of oil aren't high, because they are high, right? They're up to like $80 to $85 a barrel now, which is sort of a 5 to 10 year high. But they're not being used because we don't have the labor to actually deploy them. Right? Companies can't find enough workers to go out and actually do the work of drilling new wells. And with the existing wells that they have, they could actually deploy workers in some of those as well to refract some of those wells to increase the supply, but they can't do that because they can't have the workers to actually do it. So OPEC, it turns out, has a lot of control because there aren't yet substitutes for oil. Even though we're seeing more electric cars, it's like 3% of the total sales right now. It's a small percentage of the sales. And we can't get the labor to frack and increase production from fracking in the US. So there's not much extra supply coming on the market. Yeah.
Do you have projections on when gas prices will drop?
When gas prices will drop again?
Yeah.
Well, as far as I can tell, I mean, we're getting into the territory where you're going to start to see prices, wages for people who can frack the industry increase dramatically. And I'm going to guess that labor is going to start contributing that over the course of the near term. So I don't suspect we can get much above $100 per barrel. Right? So I think probably we'll see $100 per barrel in the next 6 months. But then we'll start to see things start to fall off. And they'll come back down quickly. Right? They always go up and come down just quickly. So you're probably going to 6 to 8 months. Just don't drive anywhere. Just stay here on campus. Yeah.
Is that like the economic solution? Right now, basically just like waiting for stats. Or I didn't know if that was something to do outside factors.
I think there probably are other outside factors, but to an economist, ultimately higher wages are going to induce people to go around with other factors. So undoubtedly are other factors that are keeping people from entering the workforce. And big issues are finding, especially for because the big people who lost it the females, right? In terms of the labor force, and that largely due to household issues, how you manage household labor and kid labor, et cetera, et cetera. So, to me, that's kind of an economic. If you can actually get the prices for labor up high enough, what we're seeing now is people are starting to be willing to pay those higher wages. That's going to induce, more people into the labor market to actually, provide the child care services that you need, all the other things you need, as well as just for tracking and back into that. That's happening. You can see it. So maybe not fast enough. But I'm one dimensional. I'm an economist. I'm always going to see raise the rate. May not always be the right solution. I'm looking at answers. You guys got any other answers? Because it's quiet.
Yeah, what's that?
Why? Because the midterm?
It's not all great, just like we did for it.
You shouldn't be.
It's really hard.
I said that it was hard. I said,
It was hard and hard. Also, the airports are still.
Well, I don't have the answers yet. Okay, all I'm having the answers after class. Okay, I don't have the answers. Okay. Don't do it yet. I don't need everybody looking at all these. Yeah. You guys should feel good about yourselves. I mean, come on, you're doing great. Look, I can guarantee you. You guys want to know the distribution? How's my job? I don't want anyone. Everybody should feel good about themselves. Chalk. Okay. A, B, C, D, E. Everyone know what that is? Is the grade scale? Do you want to know what the historical distribution of grades is in this class? Can you turn the Zoom off so I don't get recorded? I'm just. This is all public record. There's no other nothing about it. So it's like, I'm gonna say it's like 25%. I gotta do this, yeah, it's fine. 45%, sometimes. Plus. That's 70. And these 20%, something like that. So really, most people are, you get like 7%, so, you do fine. And it varies from year to year. It's gonna be as high as 40% up here. But it's usually about 70% for these. Small proportion C's and D's, right? Normally that's where we are in the class. So it'll be fun. And furthermore, for those of you who like that part of the distribution, really the only way you get to this part of the distribution is by not showing up. So the chances of this people, this part of distribution in this room at this moment in time is so minuscule. Really small. All right? I mean, it's really small. So you guys are great. That's the historical thing. I don't expect them to get it this year. Okay. And plus, if we haven't even had it yet, just wait. It'll be fine. Okay. Does that help? I don't know if that helps her. It makes it worse. I don't know. Any other questions? What was that?
Like this perfect class.
What is current classroom? Well, it's because if you go and you look at the what it says on the syllabus, what A's are like 9 plus, right? The standard LSU thing. Whatever. What A? So I go by that at the end of the year, your percentage. So what's going to happen is the percent. I don't really. I'll tell you on Thursday. Right? I will tell you specifically on Thursday because typically the B is somewhere around 80, maybe like 70, somewhere between 70% and 80%, something like that.
For your class?
Yes, yeah, so, but if you went with the OSU standard distribution, it'd be like 85. So that's curvy, right? So that's recognizing that the actual test was hard, right? And that if I was trying to get a test that has an OSU average distribution on it, I would have written a test where the average was 85. I guarantee I could do that, right? So I can make an easy test, an easier test. But I chose to make a harder test. It's just the way it is, a harder test, right? To push you guys, because you guys can handle it, all right? But that turns out then that the B is going to be a lower percentage than OSU standard distribution is on the syllabus, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's kind of curving. I'm not going to do it with an individual test, but I will do it with final grade in return. Okay. You guys do great. I absolutely 100% guarantee. Probably because you guys ask a lot of questions, which is good. And nobody ever asks questions. Okay. back to cartels. You got the cartels, price elasticity substitutes, got that one. Compatibility, that was your question in the back. Whatever your hat says, I have no idea what it says, but. That's a bad word on it. Okay. I can't read it. Compatibility matters a lot, right? So enforcing the collusive agreements, so getting the, what happens typically in an OPEC case is that like right now, they're doing a really good job because people are experiencing higher prices, they're restricting output, prices keep going up, profits are going up for countries that have for about a decade now, at least 8 years, been in sort of a world hurt. If you've read anything about Saudi Arabia, something like 80% of the federal budget is driven by oil revenues, and their oil revenues have been substantially down for about the last 10 years. And now they're finally up again. So this is a great thing for the government there. And so a lot of countries are in the same boat. And that helps them enforce this collusive agreement. But as soon as, for example, as soon as those frackers in the US get back online and start producing oil, the prices start to sort of make that turn and head down, you'll see that collusion between them start to break apart quickly, right? Because what countries are going to want to do, Iran or Iraq or Gabon or whoever, they're going to want to start producing as much oil as they can, as quickly as they can, to take advantage of what the high prices they have. And that's going to set the market on a reduction in prices, right? Okay. So compatibility really matters. If countries can get along together, they'll be able to maintain the collusive agreement for longer. Income elasticity turns out to
So we see oil consumption worldwide drop in the next like 20, 30 years. So we just kind of see these places like Saudi Arabia just getting estimated.
yes.
So it's, that's such a large portion of that.
It's what it really does, even more so than what bugs people at British Petroleum or Shell or Chevron or whatever. Those are your companies right now. If the whole country, their entire basis of their model for economic success is based on oil revenues, are seeing oil revenues start to decline simply because there's a sort of worldwide peak oil is hit because the demand is falling. That's a whole different issue, right? That's a bigger concern.
They're sorry, go somewhere else.
So if that's like a problem, are some people in the countries in OPEC against being in OPEC? Because they're like, if the price of oil drops, then like everyone suffers just because of part of this agreement. Like, is it like a kind of politically divisive thing in those countries?
I don't know that it's politically divisive. I think it's politically, well, it is actually. You read some of the reports on in Saudi Arabia, because it's a kingdom, right? So it's a monarchy, and there are lots of parts to the monarchy. And I think so. This most recent king or whatever, this Mohammed bin Salman or whatever, the dude who looks not so good, killed a reporter. Allegedly killed a reporter, I guess I should say, so I don't get arrested or all that. But in any event, it looks like they're getting more centralized control there. There's less dissent. There used to be a lot of dissent. The person who was in charge the last time, the previous king. And so there are more arms that they used to argue a lot, right? And they would go to OPEC meetings, and it wasn't always clear what element was going to rise to the top in terms of the OPEC meeting and drive the OPEC meeting. So, there is a lot of discontent with these countries to begin with. And however, that it's pretty clear that they'll do whatever they can to maintain oil as an important commodity globally. So you just have to think of what the dynamics are, right? So historically, they've had a cartel. They've been able to actually do what? Help, or I should say, they've been able to sort of restrict production in order to raise prices. But in the future, as demand is falling, what do they really want to do then? They may actually have different incentives. Their incentives may be the opposite. Their incentive may be to produce as much as possible, to keep the price as low as possible, in order to keep those alternatives from having a competitive advantage, right? So I mean, there's different kinds of incentives that can take place at different points in the market. So the future actually may look different than the past. The cartel may operate strategically in the long run, even though they're not getting short-term profits, their long-run profits is benefited by trying to increase production, lower prices, and keep the competition out, right? Which is ours. And so I don't know. Let's see. Lots of speculation. Yeah.
So are they doing anything to hedge this, but not being so overly invested in oil?
Yes, yeah, so they claim it. So Saudi Arabia claims they are. I mean, they're the biggest one. They're the economy that's got the highest GDP per capita. So they have been actively trying to become have broader economic base. But it's difficult, right? I mean, they don't have agriculture. It's a desert. It's a difficult environment for agriculture. So they're going to have to do something with tech industries and things like that. But it's hard to compete in that business as well. They're not China. They're not the US. They don't have a lot of labor, actually. So they have low labor resources, right? One thing that makes the tech industry work well in the US is high access to educated labor force, right? A highly educated labor force, as well as just a large labor force. Right? Same thing in China, highly educated, the large labor force. They can make a tech sector because you need innovation. It takes people to have innovation, smart people in particular. So, but they don't really have that. They don't have, it's not like Saudi Arabia is a place where you go for education necessarily. Graduate school education. They don't have a lot of people. It's a small population, right? So they've got a lot of factors that sort of working against them to diversify their economic base. But that being said, they're trying. Okay, so on income, income elasticity matters a lot. So income elasticity demand. What's that mean? Well, so another thing that could make cartels not work so far is that if they get too successful, they can actually make economic growth slow down. Right? And that can actually work against them. That's actually what happened to the cartels in the 70s and 80s. So they were so successful in the 70s at driving up prices, where we saw those big price spikes that happened in the 70s, driven largely by the initial efforts by the cartel to work. They were so successful, they drove prices up. But because the US economy and actually other parts of the world economy were so dependent on oil, there were so few substitutes, that actually created recessionary forces, right? That caused demand for oil to actually slow down dramatically. And the economic slowdown from the 70s to the early 80s actually sort of caused a lot of harm to OPEC, right? So the demand function actually shifted in for oil, despite OPEC's efforts. They shifted in because simply they raised prices so much, people spent so much on oil, they had less money to spend on other stuff. And that ultimately led to recessions that drove, basically drove everything down. And that's essentially an income elasticity argument, right? So it's an argument of some change in income made the cartel less effective. Other suppliers matter a lot. Here you can see it. It's difficult to see. Focus on the green line. So this blue area is OPEC production. Production of oil at OPEC. This is the price of oil. So this was the big price spike in the 70s, right? The green line is oil production in Europe, driven by big increase after when oil prices went up in the 70s. But this was the big increase in oil production in the North Sea, right? And that had a huge effect on OPEC. Right? The oil production actually went down for a time, in part because oil production was rising in so many other parts of the world, right? So one of the things that OPEC was successful at for a short period of time was restricting production a little bit, driving up prices. But ultimately, those higher prices invited new supply to come online. And that new supply ultimately created enough extra supply that it drove prices down. Right? So as a function of part of the technology change, part of the discoveries in Russia and Europe. And it's the same thing that happened here in the 2000s when we had the big price increases, when the increases here in the US. Yep.
So foreign cartels and price setting is illegal in most countries, right? So do the OPEC countries not have those laws in place, or do they work around them? Okay,
Most of the Western democracies that would have those laws.
Yeah.
Most other countries don't. So, US oil companies have to be very careful in terms of collaborating with, say, for example, foreign oil companies. That are, so Saudi Aramco, right? It's difficult for US oil companies to collaborate with Saudi Aramco on big projects around the world because then they can be susceptible to price fixing arguments and lawsuits in the US. Okay. So there's also demand side technologies in effect. And this is the one that we're looking at now, obviously, which is the potential for electric cars, right? But a long time, fuel efficiency in automobiles has actually been increasing in the US. And that's created some resilience to the effects of OPEC, right? So technology change can erode the ability of the cartel and monopoly to have their impact. If you read, there's a significant strand of economic literature that suggests that, in fact, so in the US, we have what? We have the Sherman Antitrust Act, right? That you're referring to, Western democracies have laws in place that prevent monopolies from taking place within a particular country. So I'm sure your Netherlands probably has similar kinds of laws on the books, right? So some people argue that you don't actually need those in place because most monopolists ultimately will be susceptible to technology changes, supply shocks, these other factors we talked about that are going to erode the ability of the monopolists to exert their power over time. So some people argue that you really don't need laws like Sherman Antitrust. I don't know what the answer is on that. I'm just saying some people do.
Are you kind of, I just want to make sure I understand, are you kind of hinting at market failures or like, some argue that government intervention is not as efficient at solving market failures, the market will eventually equal itself out, like externalities?
Not so much with externalities, but with monopoly.
Okay,
Yes. Yeah, so what I'm saying is that there are some people who argue that the market can take care of this itself through things like technology.
okay, thank you.
So for instance, if we think OPEC is really a long-term problem, the real solution to that is it a new set of laws and regulations that somehow come down on OPEC? Maybe. Or is it developing technologies that make OPEC irrelevant, right? What's the right answer? I don't know what the right answer is, but one, some people argue that in fact actually these new technologies will actually make OPEC irrelevant. Does that make some
So it
sense?
does, I just was trying to connect some dots in my own head.
I'm sorry, the same thing up here. Okay. So has it worked? What we know is that it has worked in short time periods. In particular, we have evidence that there just time period was well in the 1970s. They were able to restrict supply, actually claim that they were going to restrict supply. If you look back at that picture, you don't see a lot of supply restriction. There were some modest supply restrictions, short periods of time, get huge price changes, right? So this was really an inelastically demanded good at that period of time. There's also some evidence that that has some effect here where they tried to restrict supply and cause prices to spike again. This is kind of right before the shale revolution. So there's evidence that OPEC has worked over short time periods. Less evidence that it's worked over a long time period. Because we can see during this period when prices were really low for oil, that was a period in which OPEC had virtually no control. And then during the shale revolution, they had less control. It's kind of afterwards, shooting prices from 17 to relatively low. But now it looks like they're back to having a little bit of price control. It probably lasts for a little bit of time. They exert some price control, and eventually, once the crackers get back in business, then the television prices start to fall. Okay. We don't just do cartels, we also do price controls. Do you guys? I'm sorry, if any of you think that the US, do you guys think the US is a free market economy? Who thinks the US is a free market economy? You don't think it's a free market economy? You think it is?
I mean, that's what they tell us.
Except when it's not.
Yeah.
Who's they?
Just like, so
Like
we
me?
learn, I feel like in the media and stuff, we just, you know, if you look up, is the US a free market, you'd probably find many things online saying yes.
Did we agree with that? Yes. 50-50 on is yes.
Also, just adults told us that when we were young.
Adults,
Yeah,
well, you're an adult.
now, sometimes I just believe what the adults told me when I was young.
You should have never been that. They're really the adults. Also, you don't know, well, you know, the US, you know, the US is great because we were like literally a socialist country for about 50 to 70 years. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's an untold story. I mean, I just love it. And who broke the price controls?
Was it FDR?
No, he started them. A communist. He was a communist. He was a communist. Communist.
Like, during the Great Depression, like, they were so worried about making like enough money, like getting the economy back, so he like passed this regulation that CEOs could expand, or like executives could expand how much they make. So like, it basically created this giant wealth gap where like, it used to be regulated that like certain executives can only make this much percent more
Well, he
than.
was the opposite track. He regulated.
Then who did that?
Yeah,
Who did that?
FDR. He's regulated everything. He created, so he's a monopoly. He's not just a monopolist, he's the worst. He's the worst president. Who's the best president ever? Who do you guys think I think is the best president? No. Who? Who?
Teddy.
Who's that? Oh, Teddy Roosevelt? He was pretty good. He was okay. Not better than FDR. Who? Nixon. Nixon, I love it. Nixon. No, Nixon was worse. I mean, Nixon was terrible. Carter, that's the guy, man. Carter's the man. I mean, Carter's the best president ever. Did you guys know that? You guys don't believe me. This is great. You know, Carter was awesome. Why was Carter awesome? We had all these price controls and he got rid of them. And Reagan gets all the credit. It pisses me off. I mean, it really makes me upset. I mean, seriously. Yeah, so we had all these price controls. We had this. So natural gas is a great thing to look at. So 1938, who was president in 1938? FDR, yeah. Natural Gas Act was passed and signed by the President of the United States of America. He had the Federal Power Commission charged with maintaining a just price, right? Let's just get the right price for everybody. So they impose these prices, and Bruce talked about that, right? So we put in prices. What else did we put in prices back in the 1930s? What else did we put price controls on? What else? What else? Come on, you name it. What else? Trains. Yeah. Planes. Yeah. Not so much on. We had to democratize people driving around, putting oil in the air, right? Trucks, trains, planes, what else? Where else do we have price controls? What was that? Food. Oh, yeah, we had price controls. Yeah, we had definitely had to affect that, right? Yeah, but pretty much everything. It was insane. Yeah. So natural gas is great. So we did it then in the 70s. These price ceilings. It's just a good example, but this was for every sector of the American economy. Basically, it's regulated by the government. It's just phenomenal, right? It's phenomenal to think that you're told from a childhood that we're some sort of great free market economy, but in fact, a big chunk of our history is just regulated. And so prices have to be dipped, they're looking to use price controls for this stuff. What's the effect of price controls? Well, just to speak with economics picture, we've got supply and demand, that's what the market price would be. Price control does what? It sets a price ceiling, so the price can't be as high as what the market would let it be. I mean, the government wants to be, no government will come along and put a price control higher, right? What the market would get, because that was just. But ultimately, they get it, why is that? You find out with natural gas, that it turns out the price ceiling right here, what happens, people don't invest in new production, and you ultimately end up with higher prices, right? Yeah.
So running during the Red Scare, we were basically operating under.
We were worse
policies
than
that
that.
they were-
Yes, yeah, we're worse than that, Mister. So hip, you're so. Yeah, it's true. So these price controls we want for price ceiling on something. And it induces producers to produce less, right? Consumers want more, so you end up with, shortages and stuff like that. We have that for years and years and years. Too little trucking, too few trains, too few airplanes, too little natural gas, right? Too much food, actually. Way too much food. The opposite of that. And so the price control is not good, but we did it. So you don't just have to have, cartels that cause prices to change, but governments can do that too, right? They can do all kinds of policies that create these sort of price controls. Artificially set the prices of natural gas, create a huge issue in natural gas because people just didn't invest, right? We ended up way less natural gas than we needed. So one explanation for why our country is so heavily dependent on coal has nothing to do with the fact that the coal was so great, but had to do with the fact that we had natural gas price controls. It just limited people from actually investing, right? We probably could have been more heavily invested in natural gas and a lot further along the way towards reducing carbon dioxide emissions today, and we've not had some stupid policies in place. I mean, that's actually a fact, right? If we exploited some of these natural gas reserves early, right? So it is a huge problem. And beyond that, when we finally decided to the Natural Gas Policy Act, so 1977, see what I'm saying? Do you know what Carter, Carter was great. When Carter put in place deregulation of every one of those sectors. And that deregulation took place in the 80s and 90s, right? So it set in place a set of laws that got rid of all these regulations on all these sectors of the US economy. And literally the growth that we experienced during that time period was really a function of what he did with Congress. But he doesn't get credit for that. I don't know whether it's the best bet or not, but I think it's pretty cool. So the Natural Gas Policy Act was sort of passed in 1977. That's when they started to decontrol prices. It did have a huge negative consequence. This is what a lot of economies face when they have price controls like this, and many other economies do this, is that you'll have a quick run up in prices, right? So the short-term effect of deregulating an industry like this is that you're going to have a run up in prices. And we saw that in the US, they experienced an increase in prices severe in the 70s. But then once investments started to pick up, and people started to invest in production of natural gas, especially offshore, down to Louisiana, Texas, et cetera. Prices went back down, stayed pretty stable. This was a big run up in prices in natural gas, which was driven by a second deregulatory effort, which is deregulation of the electricity sector, which we was talking about. And that led to a big increase in demand for natural gas for production of electricity. Right? Okay. So we have two methods of price controls. One is monopolies. The second is governments. Okay. Now, I've kind of been trying to make fun of price controls to some extent because some of them really are bad, pernicious, harmful, especially some of the ones we have in the US. But some of them may not be so bad. What's a different way to have a price control that may not be so bad? A benign price control. In an industry where it really matters. Yeah.
Subsidies. Like subsidize them and they don't have to charge higher prices.
Okay, so there's a certain type of subsidy. So in the energy sector, what are we gonna call that? Probably gonna We call it a national monopoly. All right, so this is, and it'll take a second to get to the subsidy part of this, right? But there's a big chunk of subsidy part here. So what's a natural monopoly? Oh, okay, so this is kind of the network problem, right? So the idea is that building a network is expensive, and resources could be wasted if markets are competitive, and too many companies try to build a network to your house. Okay, so this is the idea that, we really don't want every company that can produce electricity also putting in electric lines every home, right? We don't need 6 different electric lines to every house, right? That just seems realistic, right? Okay. We don't need 6 different, back in the day, when we used to actually have phone lines, right? Remember, you guys probably remember that, we actually had phone lines, right? They went to people's homes, just like cable lines did, right? I mean, nowadays, it's all just over the airwaves with cell phones and stuff like that, but back in the day, it was an actual line, right? We didn't need 6 different companies producing lines to go to everyone's house, right? We only needed one company to do that. So it is true economically that you can imagine creating monopolies where you have these sort of networks that you right? That it can make sense to allow a monopoly to exist to provide electricity to an individual's home or to provide natural gas. I don't need 6 different natural gas pipelines or 6 water pipelines, right? So there's some reason and rationale economically that, in fact, actually it's okay to have a monopoly. We're going to call that a national monopoly, right? Right? Unlike a cartel like OPEC or something like that, which is just simply trying to raise prices and profit. Here, government is recognizing that, well, if we had 6 different companies, that's kind of wasteful competition. Not only wasteful, but it create a lot of externalities to have 6 different lines, and 6 different poles, and people trying to fix those at the same time. It creates a lot of other kinds of problems, right, in society. So we don't actually want that. So we'll create a thing called a national monopoly. And a national monopoly will basically be government designated. The government will say, okay, you have the right to produce or to create the network that delivers this service, which we designate to be really important to all the households in the city. Right? So that's basically what a natural monopoly would be. But there's really good economic arguments for that. I'm not going to go through that, right? Does it make sense to people? The concept of a natural monopoly? Yeah.
Would this be similar to like a price ceiling?
Well, it will have price ceilings as part of it because when you have a natural monopoly, you then just can't let the company that runs that natural monopoly set prices on their own, right? Because then they'll have the tendency to be like the bad monopoly, right? They'll want to set prices really high. So then we have to have government regulation to actually regulate the prices that natural monopoly gets. And the government will regulate the natural monopoly's price that they get, such that they'll get, an 8 or 10% return on their investment. And consumers will get a reasonably decent price. It'll be higher than it would be if it was a completely competitive market, but lower than it would be if they were really a monopoly that had monopoly power, right? So it's kind of the government will be making a bargain between the two to make sure they keep the monopoly in business, and they'll try to hold the monopoly to some sort of, customer service requirements that they have to actually fix the lines when they go bad, make sure that they have enough capacity in order to produce the electricity when people need the electricity, et cetera, right? So really, we have natural monopoly set up for phones originally. We don't have any more because we don't have telephone lines, right? Once we went to cellular phone service, as that evolved, the natural monopoly. Here again, we're talking about that, do you really need to have a regulation break up the monopoly? So AT&T was the monopoly to the phone system. It was granted a national monopoly by the federal government, by state governments. So they produced telephone services for the US for about 100 years. Right? And then all of a sudden, they got too big for their britches, and the government took them to court. They wanted to break them up in smaller pieces. And they won the lawsuit, they broke them up. And about a decade after that happened, cellular phone service came along and further, decimated AT&T's business model. Ultimately, AT&T was bought out by another company that used the name AT&T. Okay, so the AT&T we have today is not the AT&T we had, that was a monopoly for 100 years, but it's completely different company. They just use the name because it's one name, right? So here again, we can see where, technology change kind of made the monopoly irrelevant in a sense, right? Okay, so we have sort of monopolies for phone, natural gas, electricity, say natural monopolies that were granted by the government. So how do we regulate that in Ohio, for example? We have this thing called the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, which regulated prices for the electricity sector for a number of years. Once deregulation happened and electricity prices were allowed to be market driven, what happened was the natural monopoly then was switched to what? It was switched to the local transmission lines. So we still have local transmission lines, stuff that delivers electricity to your house. It's still a natural monopoly. But as Bruce pointed out, the production of electricity at the power plants is not a natural monopoly. Right? So it's still a natural monopoly. It's just the same thing you see here, which is that we just want a single set of lines going to everybody's house. So AEP in most circumstances in the state of Ohio, not everywhere in southern, southwestern Ohio is whatever Duke Energy is, the best energy, I guess. Northeast Ohio is First Energy. They're the ones who have the natural monopoly for the lines. They get a given rate that's set by the PUCO. And anybody who delivers electricity across those lines has to pay any one of those companies a fixed rate set by the PUCO. And that fixed rate goes for making sure that those companies keep those lines up to date. Okay? So we still have those natural monopolies in place. There's another reason for the natural monopolies is this population density argument. So population densities are low, may not be profitable to connect people to the network. So this concept of universality, that is the value of the network is basically best, highest, and greatest if more people are connected to it. So what we want is as many people connected to it as possible. The only way to make sure that happens when you have a natural monopoly is to regulate it and require the businesses, and this is where the subsidies come in. So how do we get electric lines to people who live in rural areas? How do we get it? Because it was too expensive originally to build electric lines to people in rural areas. How do we get those electric lines to people in rural areas? We subsidize, yeah. So people in cities basically pay more for electricity in order to build electric lines to people in rural areas, right? So that's the concept of universality. You can only get that with a natural monopoly, a government sanctioned natural monopoly. Okay. Yeah.
So does natural monopolies in Ohio have a lot to do with, I think it was a couple years ago with First Energy, the bailout. So is that kind of like because the government having ties to First Energy, that's why a lot of people were angry about them spending all that money to help out First Energy because they're part of like a national monopoly?
So two-part answer to that. So first off, what it looks like happened there was just a shady deal all around. Right? So the whole thing was a bad deal. But the part of that that's related to the natural monopoly is the reason that First Energy had 2 nuclear power plants in the state of Ohio is because they were in a natural monopoly. They were guaranteed for a number of years a rate of return on those. Okay. And what happened to First Energy is that once they became part of a competitive market, so remember that when electricity was deregulated in the state of Ohio, it was the power plants that was deregulated. So two parts of it, the production of electricity and the sale of that electricity to consumers was deregulated, right? The transmission lines was not deregulated. So what happened to First Energy also happened to AEP and other companies, they basically had this stuff called stranded capital. They had built those power plants under a rate agreement with the PUCO, which was from a different era, which was from a regulated era. So they built those plants assuming there was going to be a set of returns on those plants that would exist for 50 years. So then the deregulation happened. And then as we saw these huge reductions in prices for renewable energy and natural gas went down dramatically, prices for natural gas went down. and the ability to produce electricity with natural gas went down, so the competition got fierce for electricity. So it turns out that the cost of those two nuclear power plants was higher, it was too high relative to the actual cost of producing every other source of electricity. So that's what drove First Energy to the point where they felt they needed a bailout. And, so that's why whatever happened. But it was a function of the history of the national monopoly. So definitely related to that. It was the natural monopoly that forced them to, have this insidious deal that they actually had. Probably not. It's just bad people run the business. They just made bad decisions. So, okay, so 2 reasons for natural monopolies. One is that you don't want to have wasteful competition, and the second is universality. Have you guys ever paid attention to your cell phone, your bills on your cell phones? Pay attention to it? Is there a universality chart on there? Yeah, there is. Don't shake your head, no, there is. Did you guys ever hear the Obama phone? You heard of that? So one of the things they tried to nail Obama with was this idea of universality. It's the most ridiculous thing ever. So, basically, people started saying, oh, Obama's paying for cell phones for poor people, right? It is accurate that there is a program that will subsidize cell phones for people, okay, who are less well off in general. It is not accurate to say that Obama invented that program, because that program has been around for 120 years, okay? So the concept of universality, when we had natural monopolies that provided telephones, was to make sure that everybody could have access to it and to subsidize people who live too far from, the city. So we built telephone lines into rural areas in order to make sure that rural people could be, have access to phones. The same way that when, the cell phone revolution sort of happened, but yet cell phone technology was a little bit expensive, it was subsidized for a lot of people, it still is, in order to make sure that people who are less well off have access to cell phones, right? To ensure universality. And I'm not making an argument for or against this necessarily, just sort of pointing out that that was not something that was new. Right? That was something that had always been part of sort of the telephone system, as a result of it being considered a natural monopoly. Okay, so electricity rate regulation was a natural monopoly, as we talked about. Electric utilities were granted this natural monopoly, regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. The trade-off was that they would be, they would have to provide decent service, and in exchange for the rate they would charge, companies would get stability in prices and consumers would get average, not marginal costs. It's actually really important. If you love economics, you'll recognize that you'll know that the average cost function is lower than the marginal cost function. This is just for anyone who's really interested in this. But the price in an natural monopoly is going to be set at the average cost. Right? So one outcome of any natural monopoly is what? Overconsumption, right? So by setting prices at the average cost rather than the marginal cost, which is what the market would do, we all pay a little lower price for whatever the natural monopoly is. We consume a little more, right? So we always consume a little more of all these things that we have natural. So a little more electricity than we would otherwise, because we've actually paid a lower subsidized price than we would otherwise have to pay for electricity. Same thing for telephone services. Same thing for natural gas, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So rate regulation applies this sort of average cost pricing. If you wonder why, in the 80s and 90s we worried about suburbs just exploding across the landscape, right? It's the same reason why a suburbs explode across the landscape. Because in fact, actually, anybody who builds a house in the middle of nowhere out in the suburbs, right, out in a cornfield somewhere, they're paying the average price for connecting up to the sewage system, right? So a new suburb built out in the middle of nowhere, really far from wherever the wastewater treatment plant is, pays the same cost for building that sewage line as someone in the existing house does, right? There no market would set it up that way, which is expensive to put that stuff together, because cities can't rate discriminate between different consumers of wastewater treatment plants. Everybody pays the average cost, and so, you know, the roots of, you know, our sort of suburb problem in the US, our overconsumption problem is this, so the way we do public finance, right? Essentially. Just kind of interesting, whatever. Electricity prices in Ohio, ever since deregulation happened, in fact, actually kind of gone down. The deregulation sort of worked. Well, it kind of gone up recently. So some of the implications of this electricity rate regulation, and this gets to the point of what happened with First Energy, with AP, with any of those companies. These electric producers overinvested in generation capacity because they don't have capacity to keep loading. So, you know, one of the, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, how are we going to change and transition our energy system? So we're given an energy system today, which is a function of this natural monopoly mentality we've had for a century. And one of the consequences of that is we have these really big power plants, right? These big ones like the nuclear power plants, large coal burning power plants, et cetera, that will guarantee the return in an era where we had the natural monopolies and we sort of slowly switched away from it. And it's created real transition problems for us, and how to move from that system with, you know, huge power plants developed for this peak loading concept, this idea that we're always going to have capacity. If you can imagine that if 50 years ago, rather than doing that, we had just given everybody a meter and said, you know what, when we start running out of electricity, we're going to raise prices, you figure out what you do in your own house, right? We would have a very different electric system today. Right? If you force those decisions back on consumers rather than having an actual operating power. But anyway, we're just about done with this. We'll talk a little bit about on Thursday. Everyone needs to show up on Thursday because we're going to do a new project. Okay. Send a note about the midterm on tonight or tomorrow morning.
Okay, so on Thursday, I have a whole day